The Dutch were fighting a poor man's war in Indonesia. If you look at its uniforms and equipment, it looks like a ragtag army. This in contrast with the pre-1941 colonial army that at least looked uniform in appearance. How were the Dutch even able to build up a force to fight in Indonesia after World War II anyway? Many different armed formations fought in this war of decolonization that lasted from 1945 till 1949. In this video, I'll present you with an overview of the Dutch armed forces in Indonesia. Keep watching. When I show you a photo of a Dutch soldier in Indonesia prior to World War II, you see this. These are soldiers of the Royal Netherlands East Indies Army, the KNIL. Now let's look at Dutch soldiers that fought in Indonesia after World War II. We have this and this. Oh, and also this. It looks like a hodgepodge of an army. What is going on here? Prior to World War II, they had this for a helmet. After World War II, we see this. Dutch helmets, British helmets, US helmets, and don't get me started on the weapons. Some M95 Hamburg carbines can sometimes be spotted. Most we see Lee Enfields, both versions, but also M1 carbines and M1 Garands. And then the uniforms. Where to begin? We have this, and this. The whole idea of a uniform is that it's uniform. Alright, we first need to discuss how this seemingly ragtag army came to be. Because when World War II ended, both the Netherlands and Indonesia were in shambles. How to create an army out of nothing. Before the chaos of World War II, the Dutch East Indies were protected by two main forces. The Royal Netherlands East Indies Army, the KNIL, and the Royal Navy. But after the war, everything changed. The Dutch were preparing to return, and that meant rebuilding an entire military presence from the ground up. Reinforcements arrived from Europe in the form of the Royal Netherlands Army, in Dutch Koninklijke Landmacht, in short KL. Both the Colonial Army and the Dutch Army had to be almost completely reconstructed, and interestingly, they leaned heavily on British military organization to do it. On a side note, by the way, if you look at images of KNIL soldiers that got away to Australia after the Japanese takeover in 1942, their new uniforms look like this. The Dutch helmet remained. So did the Dutch saber, the klewang. New were the stockings. They had replaced the patties and the American weaponry like the M1903 Springfield. This American phase was temporary and already outdated from the get-go. The KNIL had already done away with the stockings around the turn of the century to replace them with patties. Once the Dutch began reoccupying Indonesia after 1945, the KNIL gradually transitioned toward a more British-oriented equipment structure, largely because British forces initially controlled the region after Japan's surrender. The last British troops left Indonesia in the end of 1946. Early 1946, the Dutch military was led by Lieutenant General Simon Hendrik Spoor. He held authority over all Dutch forces in the Indies, both KNIL and Royal Army troops. In 1946, Dutch forces officially took over from the British on Java and Sumatra. At first, Dutch army battalions operated independently, but soon they were reorganized alongside KNIL units into 7 brigades. On Java, each brigade, around 3,500 soldiers, fell under divisional headquarters. There were 2 main divisions, A Division, based in Surabaya, B Division, based in Bandung. Each division had its own support system, signal units, tanks, artillery and logistics. A typical brigade was a compact but powerful force made up of infantry battalions, artillery, reconnaissance units, engineers, medical teams, transport and repair crews. As the conflict escalated, more troops were sent in. In 1946, conscripts from the Dutch 1st Division, nicknamed 7th December, arrived and were reorganized into C Division. By early 1947, a second wave formed D Division. These new units were spread out strategically. C Division operated entirely in West Java, and D Division's brigades were split across East Java, South Sumatra and North Sumatra. Both divisions were light infantry, built for mobility, with 3 brigades each plus supporting units. The terrain of Indonesia changed everything. Large-scale divisional warfare was rarely practical. Dense jungles, rough terrain, and guerrilla resistance meant smaller, more flexible operations were the norm. Only during major offensives, like Operation Product and Operation Crow, did divisions operate as full units. Most of the time, divisions acted more like planners and coordinators, while brigades handled the actual fighting. These brigades were designed to be self-sufficient, equipped with everything they needed to operate independently. By the end of 1946, Dutch forces in the Indies were already substantial, around 55,000 KNIL troops and around 41,000 Dutch army troops. But this balance didn't last long. By early 1947, the Dutch army had overtaken the KNIL in size. By the end of the year, the Dutch army, the KL, counted for roughly 79,000 troops and the KNIL just under 60,000. By 1948, the total force had grown to about 140,000 men, peaking at roughly 148,000 in mid-1949. But numbers don't tell the whole story. Despite the growing army, the Dutch faced a serious and worsening shortage of infantry, especially in 1948 and 1949, because soldiers were wearing out. After 3 years of service, many Dutch troops were due to return home. KNIL forces faced similar issues. Conscripts were being demobilized and professional soldiers needed rest and recovery. Even the Marine Brigade had to be scaled down. Interesting enough, did you know that former Dutch Waffen-SS volunteers fought in the Indonesian War of Independence? I did make an elaborate video on that. See the card or check the pinned comment. The KNIL was a unique and complex force, built on a mix of volunteers from across the Dutch Empire. Its soldiers were primarily professionals, signing contracts to serve, both from the Netherlands and from Indonesia itself. But as World War II ended, the KNIL needed more men fast. The KNIL itself was deeply multi-ethnic, but not evenly so. The officer corps was overwhelmingly Dutch, while the rank and file consisted largely of Indonesian soldiers supported by a corps of Dutch and Eurasian troops. Interestingly, during the years 1945 to 1948, the number of Dutch soldiers was higher than before the war. This wasn't by design, it was because key recruitment regions in Java and Sumatra were inaccessible during the conflict. Instead, the KNIL recruited heavily from minority groups across the archipelago. These included Ambonese and Manadonese, among others. Many of these communities were Christian and had long been viewed by the Dutch as more reliable allies, forming a counterbalance to the largely Muslim Javanese population. By December 1949, the KNIL had grown to over 66,000 men, more than 51,000 of them Indonesian. We already discussed equipment, but let's dive into this a bit deeper. The aftermath of World War II left both the Netherlands and the Dutch East Indies economically devastated. Years of German occupation in Europe and Japanese rule in Asia had drained resources and crippled industries. Now, as the Dutch attempted to rebuild their military presence overseas, they faced a harsh reality. They simply didn't have the means for a fully equipped modern war effort. What followed was, in many ways, a poor man's war. Rebuilding and supplying the KL and the KNIL became a massive challenge, with limited domestic production and tight budgets. The Dutch were forced to rely heavily on foreign equipment. Large quantities of weapons and vehicles were sourced from British, Canadian and Australian surplus stocks scattered across Europe, India and the Pacific after the war. Some supplies even came directly from British and Australian units still stationed in the region. Even then, it wasn't enough. In many cases, Dutch units had to make do with whatever was available. This meant supplementing their arsenals with captured Japanese weapons or pre-war KNIL equipment. It must be said that the Indonesians made more use of Japanese weapons, as they managed to get their hands on that. Regarding pre-World War II Dutch weaponry, on photos the Dutch saber, the klewang, is seen as it could function as a machete to hack your way through the jungle, and here and there a Hambrook carbine. As far as I know, Hambrook rifles weren't used that much in the 1945-49 conflict, but feel free to correct me. Anyway, the result was a highly mixed and often inconsistent arsenal. Despite this patchwork approach, a degree of standardization did emerge. The core infantry weapons were largely British. Soldiers were typically armed with the both Lee Enfield bolt-action rifles, the SMLE Mark III and the No. 4 Mark I. This was supported by the compact and inexpensive Sten submachine gun. At the squad level, the Bren light machine gun provided reliable automatic firepower. For heavier support, platoons used 2-inch mortars while battalions relied on 3-inch mortars alongside the durable Vickers medium machine gun. Artillery units were built around the British 25-pounder gun howitzer, one of the most versatile field guns of the era. KNIL artillery units often used a modified version of the same weapon, a shortened breakdown model that could be transported more easily across the challenging landscapes of Indonesia. These variants were supplied by the Australian Army, highlighting once again how dependent the Dutch war effort had become on Allied resources. Mobility was just as improvised. The Dutch relied on a wide range of Allied vehicles, including jeeps for reconnaissance and transport, trucks and weapon carriers for logistics. Armored units reflected this same diversity. Squadrons operated Humber Mark IV armored cars and Humber Mark II scout cars alongside Canadian trucks. For heavier firepower, the Dutch deployed light tanks provided by the British Indian Army. These included dozens of M3A3 Stuart tanks. While these tanks were not ideally suited for jungle warfare, they offered valuable speed and firepower in an environment where armored support was limited. The KNIL's aviation branch, the ML-KNIL, contributed 8+ squadrons to the war effort. They used material from World War II, aircraft like the North American B-25 Mitchell medium bombers, the North American P-51D and K Mustang fighters, among others. In the end, the Dutch military in Indonesia was far from a uniform modern fighting force. It was an army built out of necessity, assembling from surplus equipment, outdated weapons and captured gear from across the globe. And yet, despite its limitations, it remained capable of conducting large-scale operations. The real question was not whether it could fight, but how long it could sustain such a war under constant strain. Prior to the large-scale Dutch actions, a Dutch military officer warned that bringing Indonesia back under Dutch control would be extremely difficult, if not impossible. His name was Wilbrandus Schilling, now a major general. He had fought in Aceh decades earlier, and he knew how difficult counterinsurgency warfare was. He warned that the troops of the Indonesian Republic were far stronger than expected, and what they lacked in experience, they compensated for with high morale. Schilling estimated that for Java alone, 200,000 men would be needed, and that the war could last up to 10 years. He was sidelined. But right he was. As said before, at the core the Dutch had two main armies, the KNIL and the KL. You can think of the KNIL as the colonial army and the KL as the expeditionary force sent to fight the war. The KNIL had an air arm known as the ML-KNIL, as discussed before. Then there was the naval side. The Royal Dutch Navy handled transport, logistics and control of the seas, but it also fielded its own ground troops in the form of a Marine brigade. These Marines were elite infantry, trained partially in the United States during World War II and heavily influenced by American doctrine. They were often used as shock troops, especially in amphibious operations. They wore USMC field uniforms. On top of these conventional forces, there were specialized units. One of the most important was the Korps Speciale Troepen, or KST. This was a KNIL unit that specialized in counterinsurgency. Operating in small mobile groups, they were particularly active in areas like South Sulawesi and became known for their aggressive and controversial methods. They were essentially the KNIL's special forces. Finally, there were the so-called commandos. This term can be confusing because it was used in more than one way. On one hand, it referred to Dutch troops trained along British lines during World War II, who later formed units like the Korps Commandotroepen. These were elite troops trained in Europe for special missions. On the other hand, the term commando was sometimes used more loosely in Indonesia to describe small aggressive units, including those operating in a similar role as the KST. In practice, all of these forces were mixed together. KNIL and KL units often operated side by side, Marines supported army operations, and special units carried out independent missions. Instead of a single unified army, the Dutch war effort in Indonesia was carried out by a combination of colonial troops, European reinforcements, naval infantry, and elite special forces, all working together in a complex and sometimes improvised system. Despite its successful operations in the field, especially during the 1948-49 Operation Crow, where they captured the Indonesian nationalist leadership, the Dutch were pressured to halt the offensive. This raises the question whether the Dutch could have won the war against the Indonesian Republic. Click here to find out more.